When did your racist neighbor's 911 call backfire so badly they lost their house? I was grilling burgers in my backyard when Gregory Whitmore appeared at the fence line with his phone already raised like a weapon. His face had that particular shade of red that white men get when they're about to make your skin color their business. He didn't say hello or ask how I was doing after 3 months of living next door to each other. Just started filming me while I stood there with tongs in one hand and a beer in the other, trying to figure out what fresh hell suburban life was bringing this time. His voice came out tight and aggressive, demanding to know what I was doing in this neighborhood and whether I had permission to be using that property. I looked at my own house behind me, then back at him, genuinely confused about whether this was real life or some kind of social experiment. When I told him I lived here, he actually laughed and said he'd lived on this street for 15 years and knew every homeowner personally, and I definitely wasn't one of them. The absurdity would have been funny if his finger wasn't already dialing 911 while he kept that camera trained on my face like I was committing a crime by existing. My wife Simone came outside when she heard the raised voices, and Gregory's entire demeanor shifted so fast I got whiplash watching it. Suddenly, he was all apologetic smiles and neighborly concern, explaining to her that he was just making sure everything was secure because there'd been some break-ins lately and he didn't recognize me. Simone's a white woman from Connecticut, with exactly zero patience for this particular brand of nonsense, and I watched her face go through about 5 emotions before settling on the kind of cold rage that makes grown men reconsider their life choices. She told him very slowly and very clearly that I was her husband. We'd bought this house in March, and if he ever came onto our property filming us again without permission, she'd be the one calling the police. Gregory's smile cracked around the edges as he backed away from the fence, muttering something about just being careful and looking out for the neighborhood. But his eyes stayed on me the whole time with this calculation behind them that made my stomach tight, like he was already planning his next move and just needed to figure out the angle. That night, I couldn't sleep, lying there staring at the ceiling while Simone breathed steady beside me. We'd moved to this neighborhood specifically because it was supposed to be progressive and diverse, one of those suburbs that prided itself on rainbow flags and Black Lives Matter signs in every third yard. The real estate agent had made such a big deal about the community values and how welcoming everyone was. But I'd grown up in Atlanta, spent my whole life reading the subtext of white spaces, and I knew the difference between actual acceptance and performative allyship. Gregory's reaction today wasn't about protecting the neighborhood from crime. It was about protecting the neighborhood from me, from the fundamental wrongness he felt seeing a black man comfortable in a space he'd mentally designated as white territory. I'd seen that look before, usually right before something bad happened, and every instinct I'd developed over 34 years was screaming that this wasn't over. The next morning, I found my trash cans knocked over and garbage strewn across my driveway. Could have been raccoons or wind, but the cans were heavy-duty and had been standing just fine for 3 months. I cleaned it up before heading to work, making a mental note, but trying not to let paranoia take root. 3 days later, it happened again, and this time I noticed the security camera Gregory had mounted on his garage was angled directly at my property. When I got home that evening, there was a notice from the HOA in my mailbox about a violation for leaving trash containers visible from the street outside of collection hours. The violation included a photo time-stamped at 6:47 a.m., exactly when I'd been in the shower before work. I sat in my car reading that notice 5 times, feeling my blood pressure climb with each pass, understanding with perfect clarity that Gregory had knocked over my cans, photographed them, and filed a formal complaint within the hour. Simone wanted to confront him immediately, but I'd learned a long time ago that angry black men don't get the benefit of the doubt in situations like this. Instead, I installed my own security cameras covering every angle of our property, including the fence line where Gregory had filmed me. The cameras cost more than I wanted to spend, but they felt necessary in a way that made me resent needing them. We were paying a mortgage on a house that was supposed to be our home, our safe space, and instead I was fortifying it like enemy territory. My dad called that weekend to check in, and I heard myself downplaying the situation, telling him it was just a misunderstanding with a nosy neighbor. But he'd lived through actual segregation in Alabama, had stories about white neighbors who'd done much worse than file HOA complaints, and the silence on his end of the line told me he knew exactly what kind of misunderstanding this was. 2 weeks of relative peace made me think maybe Gregory had moved on to harassing someone else. Then I came home on a Wednesday to find 3 police cars parked in front of my house, and officers standing on my porch. My hands went cold, and my mind went blank, except for every news story I'd ever seen about police encounters gone wrong. I pulled into my driveway slowly, keeping my hands visible on the steering wheel, and watched one officer's hand drift toward his weapon as I stepped out of my car. He asked if I lived here with that particular tone cops use when they already think they know the answer. When I said yes and reached slowly for my wallet to show ID, another officer told me to keep my hands where they could see them. They'd received a report about a break-in in progress at this address, someone inside the house right now, and they needed to verify my identity and search the premises. I stood on my own lawn with my hands raised while they ran my license and registration, feeling my neighbor's eyes on me from behind curtains and cracked doors. The lead officer's radio crackled with dispatch confirming my name matched the property records, and I watched his expression shift from suspicious to uncertain. When I asked who called in the report, he said it was anonymous, but the caller had been very specific about seeing suspicious activity and hearing breaking glass. I unlocked my front door and let them search my house, walking through each room while they checked closets and looked under beds, like they might find evidence I'd broken into my own home. Nothing was disturbed, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry because there hadn't been any entry except mine. The officers apologized in that perfunctory way that doesn't actually mean sorry, just means they'd covered their liability. After they left, I sat on my couch, shaking with rage and fear and the particular exhaustion that comes from having to prove your right to exist in a space you've paid for. My security footage from that afternoon showed Gregory standing in his driveway with his phone out, watching my house for 20 minutes before the cops arrived. Not just glancing over, but actively surveilling, waiting to see how his anonymous call would play out. When the police cars pulled up, he'd stepped back into his garage but kept watching through the window. I saved that footage to 3 different drives and sent copies to Simone's email and my brother's cloud storage, some instinct telling me to preserve evidence even though I didn't know yet what I'd need it for. Simone came home to find me still sitting there, and I watched her face crumble when I told her what happened. She wanted to march over to Gregory's house right then, but I stopped her because I knew how it would look. A white woman confronting a white man about racism on behalf of her black husband. It would give him ammunition to paint her as hysterical and me as controlling, flip the script to make us the aggressors in his victim narrative. Instead, I filed a complaint with the HOA about harassment and false reporting. I documented every incident with timestamps, photos, and video evidence. I sent certified letters to the HOA board requesting they address Gregory's behavior and install community standards about frivolous complaints. The HOA president, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had a coexist bumper sticker on her Subaru, responded with a form letter about how the HOA couldn't get involved in neighbor disputes and suggested we try mediation. The word mediation made me want to put my fist through a wall. What exactly was there to mediate? My right to live in my house without being reported to police for existing while black? But I kept my response professional, pointing out that false police reports weren't neighbor disputes. They were crimes that put my life in danger, and the HOA had a responsibility to maintain a safe community for all residents. Gregory filed 3 more HOA violations against me over the next month. My grass was allegedly too long, though I'd mowed it the day before. My car was supposedly leaking oil in the driveway, though my mechanic confirmed no leaks. My exterior light fixtures didn't match the approved style guide, even though they were the original fixtures from when we bought the house. Each complaint came with photos that Gregory had clearly taken while lurking around my property. Each one required me to file written responses and supporting documentation to prove the violations were false. Each one was designed to exhaust me, to make living here so miserable that I'd eventually give up and leave. I could see the strategy clearly because it was the same strategy that had been used to push black families out of white neighborhoods for generations, just updated for the HOA era with bureaucratic weapons instead of burning crosses. My job performance started slipping because I couldn't focus on work when part of my brain was always calculating what Gregory might do next. I worked in IT project management, a job that required attention to detail and meeting deadlines, but I kept missing emails and losing track of tasks. My boss pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, and I found myself giving the same vague answer I'd given my dad, not wanting to burden anyone with the full weight of what was happening. White colleagues would offer sympathy if I told them, maybe even outrage, but they wouldn't understand the particular fear that comes from knowing police could show up at your door based on a lie, and you might not survive the encounter. Statistics about police shootings weren't abstract to me. They were math that applied to my body, my life, my wife potentially becoming a widow, because some racist couldn't handle seeing me in his neighborhood. Simone started researching our legal options, spending hours reading case law about harassment and discrimination. She found a lawyer named David Okonkwo, who specialized in civil rights cases and had successfully sued several HOAs for discrimination. We met with him on a Saturday morning, sitting in his office while he reviewed our documentation with the kind of focus that made me think he'd seen this exact pattern before. After an hour of questions, he leaned back in his chair and told us we had a strong case for harassment and potentially a fair housing violation if we could prove Gregory's actions were motivated by racial animus. The challenge was that Gregory had been careful to use facially neutral complaints, nothing explicitly racist, just a pattern of behavior that could technically be explained as concern for property values. David said we'd need more evidence, ideally something showing Gregory's actual motivations, and in the meantime, I should continue documenting everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My next-door neighbor on the other side, an elderly Korean woman named Mrs. Kim, knocked on my door one evening with a Tupperware of homemade kimchi and a troubled expression. She'd lived on this street for 30 years, she said, and she'd watched Gregory drive away 3 other families with his harassment. All of them had been people of color, 2 Latino families and 1 Indian family, all homeowners who'd bought their houses legitimately, but couldn't withstand Gregory's campaign of complaints and police calls. Mrs. Kim had kept quiet during those incidents, afraid to make herself a target, but watching it happen again was eating at her conscience. She had her own security footage showing Gregory tampering with my trash cans, and she'd kept a log of his complaints against the previous families. Her hands shook as she handed me a USB drive with years of evidence, apologizing for not speaking up sooner, but saying she hoped it wasn't too late to help now. I sat at my kitchen table going through Mrs. Kim's files, feeling my anger crystallize into something colder and more focused. Gregory had run this playbook before, perfecting it over years, driving families out of their homes through pure attrition. The previous homeowners had all been younger couples like us, professionals who couldn't afford the time and money to fight back against endless HOA violations and police harassment. They'd sold their houses at losses just to escape, and Gregory had probably congratulated himself each time for protecting neighborhood character, never facing consequences for what he'd done. But he'd made a mistake with me, because I was stubborn enough to fight and privileged enough through Simone's family to afford the fight. And now I had evidence of a pattern, documentation that could prove this wasn't about property maintenance or security concerns. It was about systematic racial discrimination. David Okonkwo's eyes lit up when I showed him Mrs. Kim's evidence. This changed everything, he said, because pattern evidence could demonstrate intentional discrimination and potentially expose the HOA's liability for failing to act despite repeated incidents. He filed a formal complaint with HUD alleging fair housing violations and sent a letter to the HOA putting them on notice that they could be sued for enabling Gregory's harassment. The letter outlined every incident, included the pattern evidence from Mrs. Kim, and demanded immediate action to stop Gregory's behavior and ensure my safety. Within 2 days, Patricia Vance called, requesting an emergency meeting with me, Simone, David, and the full HOA board. Her voice on the phone sounded strained, like she'd just realized the coexist bumper sticker on her car didn't protect her from accountability. The HOA meeting happened in Patricia's living room because apparently discussing potential discrimination lawsuits wasn't appropriate for the community center. 6 board members sat in a semicircle looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, while David laid out our case with methodical precision. He walked them through every incident, played security footage of Gregory tampering with my property, showed the pattern of complaints against multiple families of color, and explained exactly how much liability they'd accrued by ignoring documented harassment. One board member, an older white man named Richard, tried to argue that Gregory was just a concerned citizen exercising his right to file complaints, but David cut him off and asked if he'd exercise that same concern if I were white. The silence that followed was answer enough. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice tight, saying they'd had no idea the situation was this serious and they would take immediate action to address it. I asked what immediate action meant specifically, and Patricia's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection. They would send Gregory a warning letter, implement mandatory diversity training for all residents, and create a new complaint review process to prevent frivolous violations. David interrupted to point out that warning letters and training wouldn't stop Gregory from calling 911 every time he saw me in my yard, and the HOA needed to actually enforce consequences or face federal investigation. Richard bristled at that, saying they couldn't just kick someone out of their home without due process, and David smiled in that way lawyers do when they've been waiting for someone to make exactly that argument. He noted that due process apparently didn't matter when Gregory was trying to drive me out of my home, but now that consequences might apply to a white homeowner, suddenly procedural protections were important. The board members looked at each other with growing panic as they realized they were trapped between potential lawsuits from me and from Gregory. Walking out of that meeting, I felt cautiously hopeful for the first time in months. The HOA was clearly scared, which meant they might actually do something instead of just sending form letters. But Simone was more skeptical, pointing out that scared white people don't always make better decisions. Sometimes they just get defensive and dig in deeper. She was right to worry, because 2 days later, Gregory filed a counter-complaint with the HOA claiming that I was harassing him by installing security cameras pointed at his property, and that my accusations of racism were defamatory and creating a hostile environment. The counter-complaint was 12 pages long and included references to legal precedents and property rights, clearly written with help from a lawyer. He was escalating, using the system's complexity against me, betting that I'd get exhausted by the bureaucratic warfare and give up. Instead, I got angrier, and anger is a useful fuel when you've got documentation on your side. David filed an emergency motion for a restraining order against Gregory, arguing that his pattern of harassment and false police reports created an imminent threat to my safety. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, Gregory seemed to sense he was losing control of the narrative. I caught him filming my house again, this time from his upstairs window, and when I waved at the camera, he didn't even have the grace to pretend he wasn't surveilling me. My security system logged Gregory leaving his house 7 times in one day to walk past my property, each time slowing down to stare or take photos. He was spiraling, getting sloppier, and I wondered if he realized he'd finally picked a target who wouldn't just quietly disappear. The restraining order hearing happened in a courthouse 20 minutes from our neighborhood, and Gregory showed up with his own lawyer, a stern white woman who looked like she specialized in making problems go away for people with money. David presented our evidence methodically, walking the judge through the timeline of harassment, the false police reports, the pattern of driving out families of color, Mrs. Kim's testimony about watching this happen repeatedly over years. Gregory's lawyer argued that her client had every right to be concerned about property values and security, that the complaints were legitimate exercises of HOA procedures, and that any police calls were made in good faith based on genuine concerns. The judge, a middle-aged black woman named Judge Williams, listened to both sides with an expression that gave nothing away until she asked Gregory's lawyer a simple question. Why had Gregory never filed complaints against any of the white homeowners on the street? The silence that followed was devastating. Gregory's lawyer shuffled through papers trying to find an answer that didn't sound like an admission of racism, but there was no good answer because the truth was undeniable. Judge Williams didn't even wait for a response before granting our restraining order, prohibiting Gregory from coming within 50 feet of me, Simone, or our property, from filing any HOA complaints against us, and from making any contact, direct or indirect, for a period of 2 years. She also ordered Gregory to pay our legal fees for the hearing and stated for the record that his pattern of behavior appeared to constitute actionable discrimination that could support further legal action. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something close to vindication. Watching Gregory's face flush dark red as his lawyer tried to hustle him away from reporters who'd started paying attention to the case. But vindication didn't mean safety, and restraining orders are just paper unless they're enforced. I knew Gregory wouldn't just accept this and move on, and I was right, because that night someone slashed all 4 tires on my car while it was parked in my driveway. My security cameras caught a figure in dark clothes and a ski mask approaching around 2 a.m., spending 5 minutes methodically destroying my tires before disappearing between houses. I couldn't prove it was Gregory. The video wasn't clear enough for identification, but the timing was obvious, and the police officer who took my report looked at me with tired sympathy when I explained about the restraining order. He said they'd investigate, but without clear evidence showing who was under the mask, prosecution would be difficult. I filed another report with David, adding it to the growing documentation of harassment, and paid $800 for new tires I shouldn't have had to buy. Simone installed more cameras. these ones with better night vision and motion-activated lights that would make it harder for anyone to approach unseen. Our home was starting to feel like a fortress, and I hated that feeling, hated that trying to live peacefully in suburbia required constant vigilance and defensive measures. I hated that I couldn't just come home from work and relax, that every sound outside made me tense, that I was scanning the street for threats every time I pulled into my driveway. This was supposed to be the dream, home ownership in a good neighborhood with good schools for the kids we were planning to have eventually. Instead, it was a war zone where the enemy was my neighbor, and the weapons were bureaucracy and police power. I started having nightmares about police encounters going wrong, waking up in cold sweats from dreams where traffic stops or wellness checks ended with me dead, and Simone trying to explain to news cameras how her husband had been killed for living in his own house. The HOA finally took action 3 weeks after the restraining order hearing, sending Gregory a formal censure for violating community standards and placing him on probation for any future complaints. The letter was toothless, all warning and no actual consequences, but Patricia Vance called it a strong message that the board took discrimination seriously. I laughed out loud when Simone read me that line, because a strongly worded letter wasn't going to stop someone who'd already violated a court order by slashing my tires. David was more encouraged, though, explaining that the HOA's acknowledgement of wrongdoing could be used as evidence if we filed a civil suit for damages. He started preparing a lawsuit against both Gregory personally and the HOA for enabling his harassment, citing fair housing violations, emotional distress, property damage, and the costs I'd incurred for security systems and legal fees. The potential damages were significant enough that David thought we could actually bankrupt Gregory and force the HOA to implement real reforms. Before we could file the suit, Gregory made his biggest mistake yet. I was working from home one afternoon when I heard shouting outside, and I looked out to see Gregory confronting Mrs. Kim in her front yard. He was screaming at her about betraying the neighborhood, calling her terrible names, saying she'd destroyed property values by helping me and that she should go back where she came from. Mrs. Kim was in her 70s, maybe 5 feet tall, and looked absolutely terrified as Gregory loomed over her, his face inches from hers, his whole body radiating rage. I was already calling 911 while running outside, and the dispatcher's voice asking what my emergency was felt surreal because the emergency was my racist neighbor violating his restraining order to threaten an elderly woman for daring to speak truth. By the time I got to Mrs. Kim's yard, several other neighbors had also come out, including a younger white couple who I'd never spoken to but who looked horrified by what they were witnessing. Gregory saw me approaching and spun around, still shouting, his restraining order apparently forgotten in his fury. He jabbed his finger toward me and started screaming about how I'd ruined everything, how this used to be a good neighborhood before people like me moved in, how property values would tank and crime would skyrocket because of diversity pushed by people who didn't understand what made communities work. The mask was completely off now. All the careful language about property maintenance and security concerns stripped away to reveal the raw racism underneath. One of the other neighbors had her phone out filming, and I could see Gregory's words registering on people's faces, the shock and disgust, the recognition that this wasn't about HOA rules. It had never been about HOA rules. Police sirens approached, and Gregory finally seemed to realize what he'd done, his face going from red to pale as 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car and took in the scene. The officers arrested Gregory right there in the street, cuffing him while reading his rights as he sputtered about his freedom of speech and how he was the victim here. One officer I recognized from the previous false report looked at me and shook his head slightly, like an apology for not believing me sooner. Mrs. Kim was shaking so hard I put my arm around her shoulders and walked her back to her house, sitting with her while Simone made tea, and the adrenaline slowly drained out of all of us. Mrs. Kim kept apologizing through tears, saying she never meant to cause problems, but I stopped her and said she'd done exactly the right thing by telling the truth. The problems were caused by Gregory, by his hatred and his inability to accept that the neighborhood was changing and he couldn't control it anymore. The younger couple who'd witnessed everything came by an hour later with flowers for Mrs. Kim and their own apologies for not speaking up sooner about things they'd noticed, but dismissed as personality conflicts rather than patterns of racism. Gregory's arrest made the local news that evening, complete with footage from the neighbor's phone showing his racist tirade. The video went viral overnight, shared across social media, with commentary about racism in progressive suburbs and the violence of white fragility. By morning, News trucks were parked on our street, and reporters were knocking on doors asking for statements. Patricia Vance called an emergency HOA meeting to address the situation, and this time the meeting was packed with residents I'd never seen at previous meetings, all of them suddenly very concerned about community values now that those values were being examined on television. The board voted unanimously to begin proceedings to remove Gregory from the HOA entirely, citing his criminal violations, the restraining order, and conduct detrimental to the community. It was the action they should have taken months ago, but better late than never, I supposed. David filed the civil lawsuit the next day while public sentiment was clearly on our side, naming both Gregory and the HOA as defendants in a suit seeking damages for discrimination, harassment, emotional distress, and the HOA's negligent failure to protect residents from a known threat. The lawsuit included Mrs. Kim's testimony about the pattern of harassment against families of color, the documentation of false police reports and HOA complaints, the security footage of property damage, and Gregory's recorded racist statements from his breakdown. It was an airtight case, David said, because we had evidence of intentional discrimination, the HOA's deliberate indifference, and actual damages both financial and emotional. He expected the HOA would settle quickly to avoid a trial, but Gregory might fight because acknowledging wrongdoing would open him up to criminal charges beyond just the restraining order violation. Gregory's lawyer tried to negotiate a settlement where her client would agree to sell his house and move away if we dropped the lawsuit, but David rejected it immediately. Money damages weren't enough, he said. We wanted a judgment on the record, establishing that what Gregory did was illegal discrimination, creating precedent that would protect other families from similar harassment. The lawyer came back with a higher settlement offer, and David rejected that too, because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about accountability. We'd lived through months of fear and harassment. I'd nearly been killed by police responding to false reports. Mrs. Kim had been terrorized in her own yard, and multiple families before us had been driven from their homes. Gregory didn't get to just write a check and walk away from that without public acknowledgement of what he'd done and why. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out, and in the meantime, Gregory's life unraveled in ways I hadn't anticipated. The video of his racist tirade cost him his job at a financial services company that couldn't afford the PR disaster of employing an obvious racist. His wife filed for divorce, apparently having some threshold for public embarrassment that exceeded tolerating her husband's behavior, and moved out with their 2 teenage kids who'd suddenly found themselves famous for all the wrong reasons. Gregory's for sale sign went up 3 weeks after his arrest, but the house sat on the market for months with no offers because nobody wanted to buy from someone notorious for driving down property values through racism. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Gregory's obsession with protecting property values had destroyed his own. The HOA settled for $150,000 3 months before trial, admitting no wrongdoing but agreeing to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies, mandatory training, and an independent complaint review process. They also agreed to send formal apologies to the 3 families who'd been driven out previously and offer to help cover their losses if they chose to pursue claims. It wasn't full justice, but it was progress, and the settlement money would cover our legal fees with enough left over to finally feel secure in our home. Gregory refused to settle, insisting on taking the case to trial because admitting he was racist would apparently be worse than losing everything else. His lawyer quit 2 weeks before trial, citing irreconcilable differences, and Gregory showed up in court representing himself with a banker's box full of documents he'd organized himself, still believing he could convince a jury that his actions had been justified. The trial lasted 4 days and was excruciating to sit through, listening to Gregory defend each incident with the same careful language about property values and security, while David systematically demolished every justification with video evidence and testimony. Mrs. Kim testified about watching Gregory harass multiple families, her voice shaking but clear as she described his pattern of targeting people of color. Other neighbors testified about Gregory's comments over the years, the casual racism dressed up as concern, the obvious anger whenever non-white families moved onto the street. The younger couple who'd filmed Gregory's breakdown testified about what they'd witnessed, their obvious discomfort at having to describe someone they'd once considered a friend, revealing hatred they'd been too privileged to notice before. And I testified about the fear of being in my own home, the constant surveillance, the false police reports that could have gotten me killed, the exhaustion of having to prove daily that I deserved to exist in a space I'd paid for. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict, finding Gregory liable for intentional discrimination, harassment, and infliction of emotional distress. The damages were $500,000, enough to force Gregory to sell his house at a loss to pay the judgment. Judge Williams read the verdict with visible satisfaction, adding commentary about how discrimination in housing was illegal, regardless of how it was disguised, and that communities had a responsibility to protect all residents equally. She noted, for the record, that this case represented exactly the kind of pattern discrimination that fair housing laws were designed to prevent, and she hoped the judgment would send a message to other would-be harassers that their actions would have consequences. Gregory sat at the defendant's table staring straight ahead, his face blank, apparently unable to process that his careful campaign had failed so completely. The house sale was forced through by court order after Gregory missed the first payment deadline on the judgment. The property went to auction and sold for significantly below market value because of the publicity around the case. Gregory's attempt to protect property values had crashed his own home's worth by at least $100,000, and the buyer was a young black couple with a newborn daughter who told reporters they were thrilled to be joining such a welcoming community. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Gregory losing his house to exactly the kind of family he'd spent years trying to exclude. Watching the new neighbors move in, I felt something like closure, though the trauma of those months didn't disappear just because justice had eventually been served. Some things couldn't be undone, like the fear response that still kicked in when I saw police cars, or the way I automatically scanned my surroundings for threats. Mrs. Kim brought over kimchi for the new neighbors and spent an afternoon helping them feel welcome, making sure they knew the good families on the street and which HOA board members to actually trust. Patricia Vance resigned as HOA president, apparently unable to reconcile her progressive self-image with having enabled months of racist harassment through inaction. The new board was younger and more diverse, actually committed to the values the old board had just performed. They renamed the community garden after Mrs. Kim over her protests, honoring her courage in speaking up when silence would have been easier. Small changes that suggested maybe the neighborhood could become what it had always claimed to be, a place where everyone actually belonged, regardless of what they looked like. Gregory disappeared after the sale, and I didn't spend energy wondering where he went, or whether he'd learned anything from losing everything. People like him rarely change. They just find new targets in new places and start the same patterns over. What mattered was that he couldn't hurt anyone on this street anymore, couldn't call police on families just for existing, couldn't weaponize HOA rules to drive out anyone who didn't match his narrow vision of who belonged. The settlement money went into savings for the future kids we were finally ready to start trying for, children who would grow up in a home their parents had fought to keep, in a neighborhood that had learned hard lessons about who it wanted to be. Not a perfect place, but a better one, and that had to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.